These fruits might look normal today, but their origins are so strange, it feels like looking into another universe. Mango, rich, juicy, and sweet. But wild mangoes were almost entirely fiber, stringy, tough, and with barely any edible flesh. You'd bite in expecting sweetness and get nothing but threads and bitterness. Over centuries of careful cultivation across South Asia, farmers kept selecting the best trees, season after season, until they created the smooth, rich fruit that millions now call the king of fruits. Cherry, bright, sweet, and easy to snack on. But wild cherries were tiny and so bitter, they were closer to something you'd spit out than something you'd eat. The gap between what they were and what they are now is enormous. And it happened so gradually that no single generation of farmers ever saw the full transformation. Apple, crisp, sweet, and everywhere. But the original apples grew deep in the wild forest of Central Asia, small, sour, and completely unpredictable. Some were so tart they were inedible raw. Humans spent thousands of years walking those forests, picking the best ones, planting their seeds, and slowly pulling something familiar out of the wild. Pear, smooth and juicy now, but wild pears were so gritty and hard, they had to be cooked just to be swallowed. Eating one raw wasn't really an option. Generations of farmers slowly bred out the toughness until the fruit became what it is today. Peach, soft, juicy, and perfectly sweet. But early peaches were small, hard, and had almost no flesh, like biting into a tough little stone. What's now one of the most loved fruits in the world started as something you'd barely glance at. Orange, bright, sweet, and something you've probably eaten your whole life. But oranges are not natural at all. They're a man-made hybrid, created by crossing pomelo and mandarin. One was thick, bitter, and barely edible. The other was sharp, sour, and nothing like what you'd want to eat. Early farmers brought them together, kept selecting better versions, and accidentally created one of the most consumed fruits on the planet. Nectarine, smooth skin, sweet flesh, and almost identical to a peach. That's because it basically is one. Nectarines aren't a separate fruit. They're just a natural genetic mutation of the peach. Same origin, same structure, same taste, just without the fuzzy skin. And for a long time, no one even treated it as a different fruit. It was just a peach that came out wrong. And somehow, that mistake became its own thing entirely. Lemon. Bright, sharp, and instantly recognizable. But lemons are not natural either. They were created by crossing citron and bitter orange, two fruits that were harsh, sour, and not something you'd casually eat on their own. Farmers kept selecting better versions over generations, and that harsh, almost unpleasant combination somehow became the fruit humans put in everything. Grapefruit, big, juicy, and slightly bitter, but grapefruit was never planned. It randomly appeared in the Caribbean as a hybrid between pomelo and orange, two fruits that had already been shaped by humans. No one set out to create it, it just showed up, and that unplanned accident ended up on breakfast tables worldwide. Plum, soft, sweet, and simple on the outside, but modern plums are the result of crossing dozens of wild species over centuries. What looks like one humble fruit is actually thousands of years of quiet human experimentation, and most people eating one today have no idea. Pomegranate, hard on the outside, filled with jewel-like seeds inside. But this fruit is older than most civilizations. Pomegranates appear in ancient Egyptian tombs, Greek mythology, and the Bible. The early versions were tougher, less sweet, and nothing like what we eat today. Ancient farmers spent centuries selecting better versions, and somewhere along the way, this fruit became one of the most symbolically loaded things humans have ever grown. Papaya, soft, bright, and tropical. But wild papayas were so small and bitter that early European explorers who encountered them in Central America couldn't understand why locals valued them at all. They looked unremarkable, tasted harsh, and seemed like they were barely worth eating. Through centuries of cultivation across Central America and beyond, humans transformed them into the large, sweet, smooth fruit that's now eaten across the entire world. Blackberry, deep, rich, and juicy. But wild blackberries were almost impossible to farm. They spread uncontrollably, tangled into impenetrable thickets, and tore up anyone who tried to harvest them. Humans didn't just improve the flavor, they spent centuries breeding out the chaos, creating varieties that were manageable, consistent, and worth growing at scale. Raspberry, light, delicate, and sweet. But here's something most people don't realize. A raspberry isn't actually a single fruit. Every raspberry is a cluster of dozens of tiny individual fruits fused together, called drupelets. What looks like one berry is actually a small colony. Wild versions were smaller, more fragile, and inconsistent. Farmers gradually shaped them into the uniform, sweet fruit now used in everything from desserts to medicine. Olive, small, simple, and found everywhere. But bite into one straight from the tree, and it's almost inedible. Raw olives contain a compound so bitter, it functions as a chemical defense against being eaten. Ancient humans had to figure out how to cure them, soaking them in water, salt, or lye just to make them swallowable. Something that required that much work to eat somehow became a global global staple. Blueberry. Small, sweet, and feels like something humans have been eating forever. But blueberries are one of the newest cultivated fruits on Earth. They were only domesticated in 1911. Before that, nobody farmed them at all. Every blueberry eaten before the 20th century was pulled straight from the wild, and for thousands of years, nobody thought they were worth growing. Dragon fruit. Bright, exotic, and almost unreal looking. But dragon fruit grows on a cactus, in some of the driest and harshest environments on Earth. It only blooms at night, pollinated by bats and moths in complete darkness. What looks like a modern superfruit designed for Instagram actually comes from one of the most extreme places a plant can survive. Apricot. Soft, sweet, and delicate. But apricots have been moving across the world for thousands of years. They're one of the few fruits Alexander the Great is believed to have carried westward during his conquests, traveling with armies, traders, and empires across thousands of miles before most of Europe had ever seen one. Every time they crossed a border, farmers refined them further into something slightly different. Guava. Sweet, fragrant, and found across the tropics. But guava has 4 times more vitamin C than an orange. Not slightly more, 4 times. Indigenous communities across the Americas had been eating one of the most nutritionally dense fruits on Earth for centuries, with no science to explain why it made them stronger, healed wounds faster, or kept them healthier than almost anything else they ate. Kiwi. Fuzzy on the outside, bright green inside, and sold everywhere under that name. But that name, that size, that sweetness, none of it is original. It started as a small, unremarkable wild berry from China, taken to New Zealand, renamed, reshaped, and rebranded so completely that most people have no idea where it actually came from. Avocado. Smooth, creamy, and everywhere now. But avocados were never meant for humans. They evolved millions of years ago to be eaten by giant prehistoric animals, creatures big enough to swallow that massive seed whole and spread it across the land. When those animals went extinct, avocados should have vanished with them. For thousands of years, they sat at the edge of disappearing entirely, with no animal left to carry them forward. Humans were the only reason they survived. Coconut. Hard shell, sweet water inside, and found across every tropical coastline on Earth. But no human carried them there. No ship transported them. Coconuts are built to travel alone. They can float across entire oceans for weeks and still germinate when they finally reach land. That's how they colonized islands thousands of miles apart, long before any human thought to plant one. Tomato. Bright red and used in everything today. But when tomatoes first arrived in Europe, people were convinced they were deadly. The leaves were toxic, the plant looked sinister, and wealthy Europeans were dying after eating from pewter plates that the acid in tomatoes was slowly dissolving. The fruit got the blame. For over a century, most of Europe refused to touch them. Fig. Soft, sweet, and simple on the outside. But figs have one of the strangest reproductive systems in nature. Every fig depends on a tiny wasp to survive. It crawls inside, pollinates it, and never comes back out. And here's the part most people don't want to know. That wasp dissolves completely inside the fruit. Every fig you've ever eaten had a wasp inside it. Date. Small, sweet, and packed with energy. But dates are one of the oldest cultivated fruits on Earth, grown in desert civilizations thousands of years before most foods we eat today even existed. Some date palms alive right now were planted before entire empires rose and fell.